Hi, and welcome to today's episode on Echo and Ink, where today we are exploring a group in ancient Rome called the Equites, often translated as knights or equestrians. If you studied Roman history, you've likely seen them mentioned in passing in various sources. They appear very often, but yet rarely take centre stage. But their role in Rome's history is really far greater than most people realise. They are instrumental in Rome's vast expansion and eventually in the Republic's demise. So we're going to explore who were they, and how important were they really in Rome's overall history. In ancient Rome, Equites were originally a cavalry soldier, but later became part of what became the equestrian order. They were a powerful political and later administrative class. Initially, Equites were drawn from the senatorial elites, but from the 4th century BC, wealthy non-senators could join as long as they were rich enough to afford their own equipment and horses. This requirement limited membership to the richest citizens in Rome. Rome's social structure at this time was divided into two broad classes. You had patricians, who were the aristocratic families who claimed descent from the city's founding elite, who wielded formal political power, and plebeians. They are the broader population with fewer political rights, who throughout Republican history are fighting for greater political rights and representation. The Equites occupied a position somewhere in the middle. Though they are technically, many of them, plebeian in origin, in time this brought them much closer to the patrician elites. Originally, the Equites made their wealth engaging in trade and filling economic niches that patricians often avoided. The patricians, as Rome's hereditary aristocracy, viewed commerce and trade as a slightly contemptible practice. They believed wealth should come from land ownership and agricultural production rather than this kind of mercantilist activity. This attitude stemmed from a deep-rooted Roman value that equated economic self-sufficiency and military service with virtus, which is manly excellence, and dignitas, which is personal dignity. And they believed engaging in trade, especially retail and financial speculation, was seen as transactional, kind of grubby, profit-driven, rather than the more honourable activities of farming. And this clashed with the elite's self-image. Over time, the Equites became essential to Rome, and though they held no formal political office, their influence was shadowy yet pervasive. They came to control supply chains, fund campaigns, bankroll politicians, ensuring policies favoured their financial interests. As we will see, senators needed them, generals relied on them, and people depended on their services that they were providing, which gave them huge leverage over nearly every aspect of Roman governance. So what began as a wealthy class of cavalrymen, by the late Republic, came to really have a stranglehold on power in Rome. The challenge in understanding the Equites is that no single ancient source fully explains how they operated as a class. Instead, their story is scattered across various texts, often mentioned in passing, or in specific contexts, rather than this kind of cohesive narrative. Roman Republican history is often viewed through the lens of military conquest, or the competition between the patricians and the plebeians. But yet this third force, the Equites, played a crucial role, a slightly less cohesive role. But unlike the other two groups, the Equites did not always act as a unified class with clear interests. But as a class, they exerted decisive influence over Rome's development. Their power was not always overt, but it remained a constant and evolving force, shaping the course of Roman history. So in this episode, we're going to reconstruct their story by examining key turning points in Roman history, showing how they played a key role in the story of the Roman Republic from their early role as cavalrymen to their dominance in finance and administration. What we're going to try and do is trace sometimes this shadowy but yet indispensable class and how it gradually tightened its grip on power in Rome. Due to the detail and length of this story, we're going to have to make this maybe a 2 or 3 part, potentially 4-part episode. I'm yet to finish writing the full thing. So who were the early Equites? The Equites, or knights, were originally Rome's cavalry class. As we mentioned before, they were drawn from the wealthiest landowners, only those who could afford to provide their own horses and equipment. The name comes from the word equus, which is the Latin word for horse. In the early Republic, cavalry service was both a military role and also a social distinction. And this was tied to wealth, property ownership, and also some political influence. Initially, the Equites were primarily from a senatorial elite, known as the Equites Equo Publico, whose horses were provided by the state. They held prominent positions in Rome's main voting assembly, but by the 4th century BC, Rome expanded the cavalry recruitment to include wealthy non-senators, and they were known as Equites Equo Privato, and these were people who provided their own mounts and horses. So what changed? Well, one of the key turning points in the Equites story comes in the mid to late 3rd century BC, particularly during the First Punic War, which was from 264 to 241 BC. This is when Rome's cavalry becomes less relevant. They proved less effective than their own foreign rivals, and as Rome fought overseas for the first time, it increasingly relied on allied mercenarymen and horsemen instead of its own equites. Skilled cavalry from Numidia, North Africa, became especially valuable as they were known for their fast and highly mobile tactics, which later played a crucial role in the Second Punic War. And Rome also recruited cavalry from Gaul and Spain, where warlike traditions produced strong and very aggressive horsemen, as well as from Thessaly and Greece, regions with a long history of elite cavalry forces. By the time of the Second Punic War, which is 218 to 201 BC, Rome had fully transitioned to using foreign cavalry. And Polybius notes that cavalry in war is now supplied by the allies while citizens serve on foot. With their military role diminished, the Equites turned their attention elsewhere. No longer bound to battlefield service, they focused entirely on trade, finance, and administration. As Rome expanded overseas and established its first provinces in the First Punic War, it's crucial to understand that it was not a modern state in the modern sense. Its governing structures, originally designed for a small farming town, had changed little, and most importantly, it lacked a formal civil service or bureaucratic apparatus. There were no structured administrative systems to manage Rome's growing responsibilities, meaning that solutions arose on an ad hoc basis, dictated by necessity rather than design. With territorial expansion came an increasing burden on state administration, but Rome had no standing bureaucracy to handle the increasing burden: taxation, provincial management, or military logistics. And it was at this point that the equestrians emerged as a crucial yet unofficial force in Roman governance. Once private profiteers and small-scale businessmen, they became the de facto bureaucratic machine of the state. Not through any formalized system, but because Rome needed them to step in. They took on new roles, but always in a kind of piecemeal and reactive manner, filling the gaps only when the state lacked the capacity to do it itself. One of the most pressing logistical challenges was maintaining the ever-expanding military. As Rome's legions went further afield, supplying them with food, weapons, and equipment became increasingly complex. Additionally, the creation of a navy during the First Punic War added an entirely new logistical demand on the Roman state, requiring the construction of ships, harbours, supply routes, and all of this is happening without a dedicated state infrastructure. Once again, the equestrians filled this void, not because any structured policy or permanent role was created for them, but because the Republic had no other means of meeting these kind of demands. They used their commercial expertise that they had from trade and all their trade networks and financial resources to supply the legions and the fleets. But in each instance, this was all improvised, responding to immediate military needs rather than being part of a planned or regulated system. Now, what this meant is that the Republic grew, and it grew fast, but so too did its dependence on this increasingly powerful but entirely unofficial commercial elite. So, in the light of that, we will explore next how they gradually became Rome's de facto tax collectors too. In the very early Republic, Rome relied primarily on tribute and war spoils rather than any sort of structured taxation. When taxes were required, they were collected by local magistrates and officials appointed by the Senate. Tax collection was conducted through a combination of direct levies and ad hoc assessments, often imposed during times of war or need. Local elites or officials could be involved in tax collection, ensuring compliance within their communities, and at that time the process was managed through local municipal structures. But a major shift happens after the First Punic War. Rome acquires Sicily, its first province, and with that it introduced regular taxation. Initially, tax collection in Sicily was overseen by state officials, such as provincial governors, who assessed and collected revenue through a combination of land taxes, called tributum soli, and personal taxes, tributum capitis. However, as Rome expanded its territories, managing provincial revenue became increasingly complex, prompting the gradual outsourcing of tax collection to private tax contractors. During the Second Punic War, the immense financial burden of prolonged conflict forced Rome to expand its taxation system. Emergency war levies were introduced, and tax collection became more aggressive, often managed by private contractors. With the Senate struggling to oversee taxation while directing military campaigns, equestrian tax farmers, who became known as the publicani, took on an increasingly central role, managing war indemnities and emergency levies. By the war's end, this reliance on equites had solidified their position in the Republic's financial system, setting the stage for a more formal outsourcing of tax collection in 167 BC. By 167 BC, this practice became institutionalized. This is when the Senate officially outsourced tax collection to private companies run by wealthy equites. These publicani, the word publicani coming from the Latin publicum, which meaning public revenue, these publicani bid for the right to collect taxes in any given province through a system of auctions. This was conducted separately in every province, and it was done locally. And the highest bidder secured a contract to remit a fixed sum to the state. Once the contract was awarded, the publicani took on the responsibility of collecting those taxes with the ability to retain any surplus revenue as profit. This system incentivized aggressive tax farming as contractors sought to maximize the possible revenue they could extract from those provinces to increase their own margins. And by 133 BC, after Rome acquires Asia, the tax farming system becomes fully institutionalized. But unlike in previous provinces where local authority played a role in assessment and collection, in Asia all tax contracts were auctioned exclusively back in Rome, which cut out provincial oversight entirely, and this centralization gives the equestrian publicani near total control over tax collection and didn't allow for locals to be involved in those contracts at all. This allowed them to impose levies with little provincial resistance, and the system now operated under a fixed term contract with standardized rules and oversight, making tax farming the Republic's primary method of revenue collection. So, this shift, along with those initiated by the First Punic War, collectively marked a significant transformation in Rome's expansion. This deeply entrenched these equites in the Roman economy, and as they controlled not only taxation but also provincial finance, military logistics, they began to leverage their wealth and influence to dominate Rome's commercial and financial sectors, managing trade networks, mining operations, and large-scale supply contracts for the Roman army. So they are no longer just wealthy businessmen. They have now become essential to the functioning of the Roman state, accumulating vast amounts of wealth and influence, all the while without holding any official political office. This economic power would later fuel tensions between the equites and the senatorial classes, as the equites sought to expand their political influence and protect their financial interests against potential senatorial reform aimed at curbing their dominance in tax farming and provincial administration. The next big step that we're going to talk about is the Lex Claudia in 218 BC. Before we get into that, it's important to note that although general business was seen as beneath senators and patricians, and most commercial activity was dominated by the Equites, there were certain areas where profit was too great even for senators to ignore. So while everyday trade and finance remained the domain of the Equites, there were lucrative sectors such as grain shipment, military provisioning, and overseas trade, where senators increasingly became involved as well, often using their political influence to secure contracts, monopolize resources, and manipulate the system for personal gain. As Rome expanded and its economy became more complex, concerns grew that senators were abusing their power for financial profit rather than acting in the interests of the Republic. This was seen as a direct violation of Roman values, which dictated that the ruling elite should be dedicated to public service and not private wealth accumulation. A major factor behind these concerns was the idea that we discussed before of dignitas, and with its focus on bargaining and profit seeking, business was viewed as beneath the dignity of a Roman statesman, something that's better left to the Equites, who had no political role and didn't have this kind of dignitas to protect. Engaging in commerce blurred the lines between public duty and private interest, raising fears that Roman leaders were acting like merchants instead of statesmen. Cato the Elder was one of the most vocal critics of senators engaging in trade, and he argued that commerce made them morally weak and distracted them from responsibilities to the state. This concern, combined with the growing evidence that senatorial profiteering and corruption was becoming endemic, all fueled the push for this Lex Claudia in 218 BC. One of the major areas of abuses, like we said before, was military supply contracts. And a prime example of this kind of corruption was Manlius Vulso. And Manlius Vulso was a Roman commander during the First Punic War, and he was suspected of using his influence to secure profitable overseas trade deals whilst he was still in military service. The law, the Lex Claudia, was introduced by Quintus Claudius, and he was a tribune of the plebs. The Lex Claudia specifically banned senators and their sons from owning ships larger than 304 in capacity, which effectively prevented them from engaging in large-scale overseas trade. And this was significant in three ways. One, because it legally formalized the distinction between the senatorial and non-senatorial equites, ultimately creating an equestrian class that was composed solely of non-senatorial bloodlines. Two, the Lex Claudia shifted even more power over to the equites, who now controlled all of the state's contracts across Rome, which obviously increased their leverage enormously. And as generals and governors needed these contracts, they depended on them to keep armies functioning and the state income flowing in. So now, without them, the Roman state and war machine would cease to function. Three, this also gave the equites power over senators, many of whom still wanted to engage in corrupt businesses, but could no longer do so openly because of the new law. So instead, senators often relied on equestrian allies and intermediaries to manage their commercial interests. The equites, in turn, could now start to dictate terms, demand favours, influence policy, making them a force that even the Senate had to begin answering to. So despite the law, corruption still persisted in the Senate, as powerful figures found ways to exploit the state's finances indirectly. And a very famous key example of this being Scipio Africanus, one of Rome's greatest generals, and he was known for having very close ties with the equites, and he was accused of misusing war funds during his campaign. So even with this formal restriction in place, equites and senators are now still working together, but more so in the shadows, giving the Equites even more power over the political system. The next major turning point in the rise of equestrian power came with the Second Punic War. The Second Punic War, happening, like we said before, between 218 and 201 BC, really solidified the Equites' position as Rome's banking elite too. The immense cost of sustaining a prolonged military campaign forced the Roman state to rely heavily on private lenders, many of whom were equestrian financiers. These individuals provided critical war loans when Rome's treasury was depleted, effectively becoming the Republic's primary source of credit. As the war continued, equestrian banking expanded hugely, with permanent financial houses called agentari emerging all over Rome to handle large-scale monetary transactions. These institutions facilitated the movement of funds across Italy, ensuring rapid payment to troops, suppliers, and provincial administrators. With Carthage's defeat in 201 BC, Rome imposed a massive war indemnity, which the equestrian publicani were contracted to collect. At the same time, Rome's territorial expansion created a greater demand for organised banking and credit services and money lending, all of which the Equites now capitalised on. So they are no longer just merchants. They now controlled Rome's financial infrastructure, managed public funds, military supply contracts, and tax farming, but on an unprecedented scale. The Equites also played a role in managing state debt, overseeing the repayment of war loans. They also financed reconstruction efforts in the devastated regions after the war, and all of this marked a decisive shift in their role. They went from commercial traders to ad hoc financial administrators to now the Republic's elite financial and administrative positions. And they were going to further consolidate this in the following decades. The Third Punic War, which was from 149 to 146 BC, where we finally see the destruction of Carthage, Rome now absorbed a vast and economically rich region into its empire. Now we're going to talk about the Third Punic War. As is often the case with war and its aftermath, with Carthage's destruction in 146 BC, Rome absorbed a vast and economically rich region into the empire. The newly created province of Africa was a major prize, offering fertile farmland and valuable trade networks. And for the Equites, this was a golden opportunity. First, the publicani, the tax farmers, secured large new contracts to collect provincial taxes, and they were the ones ensuring a steady flow of wealth from North Africa into their pockets. But more importantly, beyond taxation, the land seized from the Carthaginians during the war was sold off or leased. This allowed the Equites to make massive investments. They expanded large-scale agricultural estates all over North Africa, particularly in grain and olive oil production, taking full advantage of the North African fertile soil and ideal climate which is situated along the coast. This allowed them to monopolize agricultural exports, again further increasing their wealth and crucially their influence. Maybe even more important was the Equites took control of Carthage's enormous grain export market. As North Africa had long been one of the most productive grain producing regions in the Mediterranean, now that Carthage is gone, the Roman Equites replaced Carthaginian merchants and positioned themselves as the primary grain suppliers to Rome. Their dominance in both supply and trade, combined with their ownership of these vast estates, meant that they didn't just profit from Rome, they kind of controlled it. Grain was Rome's lifeline, and with each new conquest, the Equites tightened their grip, and their hand around Rome's throat squeezed just a little bit harder. At the same time as Carthage's destruction, Rome also sacked Corinth in 146 BC, delivering a final blow to Greek resistance. But in doing so, they unlocked a new wave of economic opportunities for the Equites. As one of the wealthier cities in the Hellenic world, Corinth had been a major hub for trade and finance and banking. Its fall allowed Roman Equites, already expanding their influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, to establish themselves as dominant players in Greek and Aegean commerce. With Greek city-states weakened and their economic networks now disrupted, equestrian financiers and merchants moved in, securing trade monopolies and acquiring confiscated land. And in doing so, integrated Greece into Rome's commercial system. Greek banking houses, once the backbone of Hellenistic finance and influence, were now either absorbed into Roman networks or sidelined by equestrian banking enterprises, further centralizing financial power in their hands. The pattern is unmistakable. Every new conquest brought more contracts, more land, more tax revenue, and greater control for the equestrian class. While the Senate still held political authority, the Equites had become Rome's true economic power brokers, shaping the financial policies and commercial infrastructure that underpin the Republic's expansion. So to recap, the Equites have come a long way. What began as a small class of small-time merchants and local businessmen in a modest Italian city have transformed now into an economic juggernaut that spanned the entire Mediterranean. They were no longer just traders, no longer just tax collectors. They had become Rome's economic masters, wielding power that stretched far beyond the walls of the city itself. Every war, every conquest, every shattered empire only tightened their grip on the Republic's wealth. While senators governed and generals marched, it was the Equites who handled the money, who financed the wars and collected the taxes, and controlled the supply chains that kept Rome's legions moving and its people fed. With each new province, they took more land, more trade, more contracts, more power, the riches of entire civilizations, Carthage, Greece, the kingdoms of the East, poured into their hands. They seized control of ancient trade networks that had existed for centuries, replacing old merchant dynasties with their own rising empires of finance and commerce. The mines, the ports, the grain fields, the banking houses, all of it became theirs. They weren't just making money, they were rewriting the economic order of the ancient world. The Senate still ruled in name, the consuls still commanded armies, the Republic still functioned, on the surface. But beneath it all, the Equites had built an empire within an empire. Rome had conquered the world, and the Equites owned it. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. Part 2 should be coming soon.